Hello, my friends. What we are witnessing right now, if we strip away the propaganda, the emotional manipulation, and the performative moral language of the collective West, is not diplomacy and certainly not a pursuit of peace. It is theater. It is strategic deception designed to prolong conflict, block any real settlement, and preserve Western control over key geopolitical spaces that are rapidly slipping away in a multipolar world. The casual mention of a Nobel Peace Prize in this context is not accidental. That prize long ago stopped being a symbol of peace and became a political instrument, a branding tool used to legitimize figures who advance Western interests under the guise of democracy and human rights. It is not about reconciliation or conflict resolution. It is about narrative control. When such language is deployed, it should immediately raise suspicion, because it signals regime management, not peacemaking. Europe today is playing a role written for it in Washington. The so-called Coalition of the Willing Summit in Paris is a perfect example. France, the United Kingdom, and Germany present themselves as architects of security guarantees for Ukraine, yet what they are proposing has nothing to do with security and everything to do with confrontation. The idea of deploying Western forces, whether labeled NATO or not, whether called peacekeepers or security guarantors, is fundamentally incompatible with any settlement acceptable to Russia. Russia has stated this clearly, consistently, and publicly. No NATO forces, no European forces, no foreign military presence in Ukraine under any rebranding. Moscow does not care what label is attached. The substance is what matters, and the substance is hostile. Yet Western leaders continue to behave as if repeating the same proposal will somehow change Russia's position. This is not diplomacy. It is willful denial. The most revealing detail is that the United States did not sign the Declaration of Intent. Washington stayed on the sidelines, offering vague assurances of monitoring, intelligence, and support, while pushing Europe closer to direct confrontation with Russia. This is classic American strategy. Let others bear the cost, take the risks, and absorb the consequences, while the United States retains strategic distance and leverage. Statements from London and Paris about establishing military hubs inside Ukraine after a ceasefire only confirm the underlying reality. There is no intention to freeze the conflict permanently. The plan is to institutionalize it, to militarize Ukraine indefinitely, and to use it as a forward operating platform against Russia. That is why peace is impossible under these conditions. Russia is not negotiating with Europe because Europe is not offering peace. It is offering delayed escalation. The presence of American envoys praising European leaders does not signal progress. On the contrary, it confirms that Washington is content with the current trajectory. Despite public rhetoric about ending wars, the actions tell a different story. If peace were the goal, the United States would be addressing root causes. Instead, it is managing optics while ensuring that no genuine settlement can emerge. The same logic applies to post-war fantasies about Ukraine's reconstruction and prosperity. Behind the language of jobs, investment, and rebuilding lies a familiar structure: external control, resource extraction, and financial dominance. Deals are announced, revised, replaced, and expanded, not for the benefit of ordinary Ukrainians, but for international financial interests, positioning themselves to profit from devastation. This pattern is not limited to Ukraine. It is replicated elsewhere with striking consistency. Greenland is framed as a national security concern, a strategic necessity. Venezuela is framed as a crisis requiring intervention. Different rhetoric, same method: pressure, coercion, economic strangulation, and ultimately control. In Venezuela, the mask is completely off. The demands being issued are not negotiations, they are ultimatums. Sever ties with Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. Hand over oil production. Route sales through the United States. Allow Washington to control revenues. This is not diplomacy. This is extortion. It is a textbook example of imperial behavior in the modern era. The pursuit of oil tankers in international waters, attempts to seize cargo, and the willingness to escalate naval confrontations reveal just how far this approach has gone. When a vessel changes its registry and comes under Russian protection, the situation transforms instantly from a regional issue into a direct challenge to Russian sovereignty and resolve. Russia's response is measured but firm. It sends a clear signal: piracy will not be tolerated, and Russian interests will be defended. All of these events, when viewed together, form a single coherent picture. Europe, Ukraine, Greenland, Venezuela, these are not isolated cases. They are interconnected fronts in a broader struggle over the future international order. The United States and its closest allies are fighting to preserve a unipolar system that no longer reflects global realities. Russia understands this. It has adapted to it. It is acting accordingly. What we are seeing is not a failure of diplomacy, but the deliberate avoidance of it. Peace is not being pursued because peace would require compromise, acknowledgement of reality, and acceptance of a multipolar world. Instead, the West prefers managed chaos, controlled instability, and endless declarations that change nothing on the ground. Russia is not confused by this. It is not deceived by the language of guarantees, intentions, or coalitions. It sees the strategy clearly and responds based on long-term security interests, not short-term political theater. Those who continue to believe that these Western initiatives are steps toward peace are not analyzing the situation. They are consuming propaganda. In the end, this approach will not weaken Russia. It will weaken Europe, exhaust Ukraine, destabilize entire regions, and further erode the credibility of Western leadership. The tragedy is that all of this is avoidable. The reality is that it is intentional. And until that fundamental truth is acknowledged, peace will remain impossible. If we go deeper, beyond the surface narrative, it becomes obvious that the West is no longer even pretending to solve conflicts. What it is doing instead is managing decline through controlled crises. Ukraine is not a mistake, and it is not a failure of policy. It is a model of how to bleed an adversary, discipline allies, and maintain leverage without taking direct responsibility for the consequences. Europe's behavior in this crisis is particularly revealing. European leaders talk about sovereignty, values, and unity, yet every major strategic decision is outsourced to Washington. The so-called European security architecture no longer exists as an independent concept. It has been hollowed out and replaced by dependency. This is why European governments can make declarations about deploying troops or establishing military hubs without any realistic assessment of escalation risks. They are not acting as sovereign actors. They are acting as managers of an American strategic project. Russia, by contrast, is acting as a sovereign power. It defines its red lines clearly, articulates them consistently, and enforces them when necessary. This asymmetry is crucial. One side operates through ambiguity and public relations. The other operates through strategic clarity. That is why Western policymakers miscalculate repeatedly. They assume Russia thinks the way they do. It does not. The refusal to acknowledge Russia's security concerns is not ignorance. It is deliberate. Accepting those concerns would mean admitting that NATO expansion was not defensive, that Ukraine was instrumentalized, and that the post-Cold War order was built on false premises. Such an admission would undermine the legitimacy of Western leadership at home and abroad. Therefore, denial becomes policy. This is also why ceasefire discussions are structured the way they are. A ceasefire, under Western terms, is not meant to end hostilities. It is meant to freeze the battlefield long enough to rearm, reorganize, and reposition. This is why proposals always include foreign military presence, training missions, and long-term security guarantees that effectively turn Ukraine into a permanent militarized buffer. Russia understands this perfectly. That is why it rejects these proposals outright. The same pattern appears in the economic dimension of the conflict. Sanctions were supposed to collapse Russia's economy, isolate it, and trigger internal instability. None of that happened. Instead, Europe absorbed the shock. Energy prices surged, industrial competitiveness declined, and social cohesion eroded. Yet instead of reassessing policy, European governments doubled down. At that point, sanctions ceased to be a tool and became an ideology. Ukraine itself has become an object rather than a subject. Its population is spoken about, but rarely listened to. Decisions affecting its future are made in Paris, London, Berlin, and Washington, not in Kyiv. The promise of reconstruction is dangled as a reward, while the reality is perpetual dependency. A country that is permanently armed, indebted, and externally managed is not sovereign. It is administered. This brings us to the broader strategic picture. What is happening is not limited to Europe. It is part of a global attempt to enforce compliance in a world that is increasingly resistant to it. Venezuela is a prime example. The language of democracy is used, but the demands are purely economic and geopolitical. Cut ties with non-Western partners. Hand over strategic resources. Accept external oversight. This is not regime change for values. It is regime change for control. The maritime incidents involving oil tankers illustrate the dangerous edge of this strategy. Once a state feels entitled to seize assets beyond its jurisdiction, international law becomes irrelevant. At that point, power replaces rules. Russia's response to these actions is not emotional, it is procedural. Protect assets, assert jurisdiction, and signal deterrence. That is how serious states behave. What Western leaders fail to understand is that Russia is not improvising. It is executing a long-term strategy shaped by decades of experience, including the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO expansion, economic warfare, and proxy conflicts. The lesson Russia drew from the 1990 seconds is simple. Weakness invites exploitation. Strength, clearly communicated and consistently applied, creates stability. The West, however, is trapped in its own narratives. It must constantly reassure its publics that it is winning, that its policies are working, and that escalation is manageable. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Leaders begin to believe their own propaganda. Strategic reality is replaced by media framing. At that point, rational decision-making deteriorates. We are now at a stage where the conflict is sustained not because it serves peace, but because ending it would expose too many uncomfortable truths. It would reveal who benefited, who misled, and who paid the price. It would require accountability. Therefore, the war continues. Russia's position remains fundamentally defensive, despite Western claims to the contrary. It is defending its strategic depth, its borders, and its role in the international system. It is not seeking confrontation with Europe. It is responding to encroachment. This distinction matters, even if Western media refuses to acknowledge it. As this conflict drags on, the balance of costs becomes increasingly uneven. Russia adapts, Europe weakens, Ukraine bleeds. And the United States recalibrates, shifting focus as needed, ready to pivot to the next crisis while leaving others to deal with the aftermath. This is not a strategy for peace. It is a strategy for control in a world where control is slipping away, and that is precisely why it will ultimately fail. At this stage, it is no longer possible to argue that the West is miscalculating unintentionally. What we are witnessing is not confusion, it is compulsion. Western political systems have become structurally incapable of reversing course once a narrative has been locked in. Ukraine has turned into a symbolic battlefield that Western elites cannot afford to abandon, not because it is strategically indispensable, but because walking away would expose the hollowness of their authority. This is where the conflict becomes existential for the West, not for Russia. Russia can survive without Western approval, Western markets, or Western institutions. The West, however, has built its identity on the assumption that it defines legitimacy, morality, and order. Losing that monopoly is far more threatening than any territorial loss. Ukraine, therefore, is being used as a proof of concept, a demonstration that the West can still impose outcomes through pressure, even when reality contradicts it. The danger of this mindset cannot be overstated. When credibility replaces strategy as the primary objective, escalation becomes almost inevitable. Every concession is interpreted as weakness, every compromise as defeat. This is why Western leaders reject negotiations that acknowledge Russia's security demands. Accepting them would mean admitting limits to Western power, and that is psychologically unacceptable to systems that equate dominance with survival. Meanwhile, Russia operates from a fundamentally different strategic culture. It does not seek validation from international applause. It measures success in terms of security outcomes, territorial integrity, and long-term stability. This difference in mindset explains why Russia can absorb pressure that would destabilize most Western societies. Russian decision-making is insulated from media cycles, polling panic, and electoral theatrics. The Western escalation ladder is also constrained by its own contradictions. Europe speaks of war readiness while deindustrializing itself. It promises military aid while draining stockpiles faster than it can replenish them. It invokes unity while fragmenting internally under economic and social stress. These are not signs of strength. They are symptoms of systemic overextension. Ukraine's role within this framework is deeply tragic. It has been transformed into a strategic consumable. Its population, infrastructure, and future are being expended to maintain a geopolitical narrative that no longer aligns with material reality. Each new promise of support delays an inevitable reckoning while increasing the human cost. From a strategic perspective, this is not assistance. It is exploitation. The Western refusal to acknowledge this exploitation is tied to the myth of moral exceptionalism. As long as actions are framed as defending democracy, any consequence becomes acceptable. Economic collapse, demographic loss, and territorial devastation are rationalized as necessary sacrifices. History shows where this logic leads, and it is never to stability. Russia's response to this dynamic has been methodical. Rather than chasing Western approval or attempting to win information wars on Western platforms, it is focused on shaping facts on the ground. Control of territory, protection of supply lines, and strategic depth matter more than headlines. This is a lesson the West has forgotten. Narratives cannot override material power indefinitely. The widening scope of confrontation spanning Europe, energy markets, maritime trade, and global finance reveals another critical miscalculation. The West assumes it can compartmentalize conflicts. Russia understands they are interconnected. Pressure in one domain will produce responses in others. This is why attempts to isolate Russia only accelerate the formation of alternative networks beyond Western control. At this point, the question is no longer whether Western strategy is sustainable. It is whether Western institutions are capable of recognizing failure before it becomes catastrophic. So far, the evidence is not encouraging. Political survival has replaced strategic foresight. Leaders are managing optics, not outcomes. For Russia, time is not the enemy. For the West, it is. Every month of prolonged conflict erodes European economic resilience, undermines public trust, and deepens internal divisions. Russia, by contrast, consolidates, adapts, and recalibrates. This asymmetry is decisive, even if it is rarely acknowledged. The most dangerous illusion in Western capitals is the belief that Russia will eventually get tired and concede. This is a profound misunderstanding of Russian history and political culture. Russia does not capitulate under pressure. It hardens, it restructures, and it waits. We are approaching a moment where the gap between narrative and reality becomes impossible to bridge. When that happens, policy will shift abruptly, not through careful negotiation, but through crisis. That is how strategic denial ends, not with a peaceful transition, but with a shock that forces recalibration. Ukraine is not the end of this process. It is the catalyst. The real struggle is over the structure of the international system itself. And in that struggle, the West is reacting while Russia is acting. We are now at the end of the illusion, even if many in the West are still pretending otherwise. The conflict that has been framed as a struggle for democracy, values, and international order is, in reality, a reckoning with power, limits, and historical consequence. What is collapsing is not Ukraine alone, nor even European security as it once existed, but the credibility of a system that assumed it could expand indefinitely without resistance. The defining error of the West has been its refusal to accept that the post-Cold War moment is over. That era, built on Russian weakness and Western triumphalism, no longer exists. Yet policy continues to operate as if it does. Ukraine became the stage on which this denial was acted out, with catastrophic consequences for those forced to perform upon it. Russia entered this confrontation not to conquer the world, not to destroy Europe, but to draw a line that could no longer be ignored. That line was crossed repeatedly, deliberately, and with full awareness of the risks. When diplomacy failed because it was never sincerely pursued, Russia reverted to the only language that still commands respect in international politics: power exercised in defense of vital interests. The West misinterpreted restraint as weakness. It assumed that economic warfare, information dominance, and proxy conflict could substitute for strategic compromise. Instead, these tools revealed their own limitations. Sanctions hardened rather than fractured Russian society. Military aid prolonged war without changing outcomes. Rhetoric escalated while material capacity declined. Europe now faces a future it was not prepared for: diminished autonomy, weakened industry, fractured politics, and a security environment more dangerous than the one it inherited at the end of the Cold War. These outcomes were not imposed by Russia. They were chosen by European leaders who surrendered strategic judgment in exchange for alignment and approval. Ukraine's tragedy will echo for generations. A nation was encouraged to believe that history could be defied, that geography could be ignored, and that great power politics had been abolished. None of this was true. When reality reasserted itself, it did so violently. Those who promised victory will not bear the cost. Those who believe them already have. Russia, meanwhile, has reasserted itself as a central actor in the international system, not through slogans or moral grandstanding, but through endurance, adaptation, and strategic coherence. It has demonstrated that sovereignty is not granted by institutions or declarations, but secured through the capacity to defend it. The world that emerges from this conflict will not resemble the one that preceded it. Power will be more distributed. Influence will be negotiated rather than dictated. States that understand limits will survive. Those that deny them will fracture. This transition will be turbulent, but it is unavoidable. The greatest danger now lies not in escalation, but in delayed recognition. The longer Western leaders cling to failed narratives, the harsher the eventual correction will be. History offers no rewards for denial. It only records the cost. Peace will come, but not through declarations of intent or manufactured coalitions. It will come when reality is acknowledged, when security interests are respected, and when ideology yields to strategy. Until then, the conflict will continue, not because it must, but because some refuse to let go of a world that no longer exists. This is not the end of history. It is the end of an illusion. And those who understand that first will shape what comes next.